With everything that'll go into matchups between South Carolina and LSU moving forward in women's college basketball, folks, I think it's time we start saying it. This is a rivalry.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also the lead publisher for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available, as always, both wherever you get your audio podcasts daily and also on YouTube. This episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today at nissanusa.com. We got a lot to dive into on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. The spring football roster has been released, and while there's not a whole lot of takeaways to be had, we could be getting a hint about what kind of defensive scheme the team could be running this next season. I'll talk about that later in the show, and to start today's show, we're going to continue talking about what will happen between South Carolina and LSU on Sunday afternoon in the SEC tournament title game. And not necessarily the fight itself, but more so the aftermath of the fight and how this now changes the entire meaning behind South Carolina's women's basketball series with the LSU Tigers. Simply put, it's time to start saying it. This is now officially a rivalry in women's college basketball. Now, there are three different components, in my opinion, that you must have in order to call a particular matchup a rivalry. The first component that you need to have is this. The game has got to be competitive. And I know that a lot of Gamecock fans are going to hear that and you're going to stop and you're going to say, Andrew, do you realize that South Carolina has won, 16 straight games over the LSU Tigers? You should stop your conversation right then and there. This is not a rivalry. And sure, in terms of sheer wins, you would probably be correct on that. But here's the pushback that I would have for that. This season, the meetings between both of these teams have been uber competitive, especially compared to years past, as both matchups to this point this season have been decided by 7 points or less, meaning that if you flip-flop a play here or there, LSU could have gotten the game in Baton Rouge. They maybe even could have mounted a little mini comeback against the Gamecocks in Greenville this past weekend. So it's not like South Carolina is just blowing LSU out of the water. We do have to acknowledge that. And in my opinion, as long as you can say that the game is competitive in that manner, then you can say that this is a rivalry. Now, the second component that you need to call a series a rivalry is the external implications. In essence, the game has a deeper meaning than other games, and this could mean a bevy of different things. It could be geographic, in essence, a in-state battle. So South Carolina versus Clemson in basically every single sport. It can also be sort of a measuring stick type game. When we play X team over here, we're going to find out very quickly what kind of team we've got and where we need to get better before we hit sort of the meat of our schedule. So take South Carolina versus Georgia in football between the years of 2005 to 2015, basically when Steve Spurrier and Mark Richt were coaching against one another on opposing sidelines on those Saturdays. And then obviously, you can have championship implications riding on that particular game, and that certainly exists with South Carolina and LSU in women's college basketball, both in the SEC and also nationally speaking. Now, obviously, for South Carolina, look, they could have lost on Sunday afternoon. They would have still been the number one overall seed in the NCAA tournament. It hasn't taken place yet, But obviously, it'd be the easiest bet in all of gambling history if they had it as a prop bet for this next Sunday afternoon. LSU, however, they're trying to move up the seed lines. At one point a few weeks back, I think they were actually viewed by some as potentially a number 4 seed. But now they're back up to being, number 3 seed, maybe even number 2 seed, just on the outside of looking at a number 1. So, this game 100% has deeper implications than every other game. It's not the same as South Carolina playing Georgia or Florida in the SEC women's college basketball. It's just not. And then obviously, the last component that you must have in order to call a series a rivalry, both sides have to have genuine dislike for one another. And I would say that mainly starts with the fans, but eventually, if it exists long enough over a certain period of time, it permeates on down to the athletes and the coaches themselves. I think it's fair to say South Carolina does not like LSU, and LSU does not like South Carolina. From South Carolina's side of things, I think that just in the past year, Gamecock fans, and probably a lot of members of that Gamecock program, probably got sick and tired of hearing all about how LSU was the reigning defending national champions. And listen, nobody can ever take that title away from them. They won it fair and square. They did what they had to do in order to win it. However, I think that we all agree, and I think if you gave truth serum to most Tiger fans, they would agree as well. If that had been South Carolina LSU battling it out for the national championship last year, the Gamecocks would have wiped the floor with LSU. Okay, their only meeting before then, it was not even close. South Carolina's team was on a mission. Unfortunately, that mission was derailed by Caitlin Clark in the Final Four, and that took a lot of mistakes happening from South Carolina's side to even leave the door open for them to pull off the upset. Also, here's the other thing. With how LSU runs their program, we could just go ahead and say it. The Tigers, they have money, and they do not mind flaunting it, and they do not care how you feel about that. And that is obviously a pretty stark contrast to how Dawn Staley runs her program. And listen, Dawn is all about players, increasing their net worth and making sure that they understand how to operate in business, how to increase your own value. No issue with that, obviously. But with LSU, it's just a little bit different. They seem to have no issue flaunting materialistic type items and that kind of attitude. And for South Carolina, a program that prides itself on development and working for those opportunities before it's just handed down to you, because these days, especially for college athletes, people will just give it to you. Maybe if you haven't even put in enough work to get there. You could see why maybe there'd be a dislike in that regard, again, from the fan base and maybe even some people inside that building. Now, for LSU, again, some obvious reasons why maybe they would hate South Carolina. For one, the Gamecocks basically win all the time. The Tigers have not found a way to beat them in around a decade or so. And when we talk about national title contenders, the Gamecocks always get mentioned first ahead of LSU, even though the Tigers did win the national championship last year. And they can't wrap their heads around that, nor the fact that there is a sport that exists where South Carolina has just mollywopped LSU, again, going on a decade now. The Tigers are not used to seeing that, and so there's a bit of arrogance maybe in that regard, but, that's one reason why they would hate South Carolina. Also, in terms of the games itself, the Tigers feel like probably that South Carolina gets away with a little bit more than most teams because of leniency from the officials, because they now have that pedigree to where maybe they do get some more favorable calls than they would have, say, 10, 12 years ago. And I think that it's fair to admit that probably does exist. We can't say it exists for other teams like maybe a Duke or North Carolina on the men's side of things, but it doesn't exist for South Carolina on the women's side. But obviously, it's not like South Carolina just gets away with murder every game, nor are they maybe Lily White in terms of, physical play. It's probably somewhere in the middle like most disputes. So, although Gamecock fans might not agree with this, from the face of it, there's no question this is a rivalry now between South Carolina and LSU. And this game already was building up towards being a rivalry in this sport. But that fight on Sunday, obviously, again, we hope it doesn't happen again, but now it has changed the way that people are going to look at this game. We cannot deny that. But also, I think that there's no doubt that this rivalry will be good for the entire sport of women's college basketball. And I'll give y'all my opinion on why I think that would be the case in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. The 2024 Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and great escapes. It also has a built-in class-exclusive Google Assistant, which is always updating and can call for almost anything. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system. The 2024 Rogue is the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure. You can also look at the 2024 Nissan Armada, which will change what you expect from a full-size SUV. Picture a rugged 4x4 that could seat up to 8 in first-class luxury and style, that can also tow bigger and explore further. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Armada, or Nissan Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen wherever you get your audio podcasts daily, or your first watch on YouTube. Now, if we start calling South Carolina's series with LSU and women's college basketball a rivalry, I think that it is fair to say that that would be good for the entire sport. And there's a few different reasons that go into this. One, women's college basketball, look, they are at a very interesting point in its history at this moment in time, because right now, it is fair to say that in terms of individual player talent, women's college basketball has never been in a better spot, because not only is that talent plentiful, but it's also not concentrated in one geographic area or just one particular conference. So you look at some of the star freshmen, for example. South Carolina obviously has Mylasia Fulwiley, and while she might not be a household name in terms of every region of the country just quite yet, because she is not a day-to-day starter, Fulwiley is 100% going to be a living highlight reel whenever she gets a full opportunity to show what she can do. Notre Dame's got Hannah Hidalgo. Southern Cal has got Juju Watkins, and LSU, they've got Michaela Williams. And while that is important, you have to have the star power in order to help promote and brand your sport. You do need, some star power in terms of teams, and you obviously need more than just one team that you can count on to be a legit contender for the national title. And that's why, in my opinion, UConn's dominance, it did get to a point where it kind of held the sport back, because sure, UConn inspired a lot of young girls, a lot of teenage girls to pursue women's basketball, and not all of them obviously can go to UConn. And so this generation of basketball talent, UConn was probably a big influence on why they got into basketball. You do have to give UConn credit for that. And it's not their fault that this is the case, but because of the fact that they were sort of the lone power at the top for so long, I think that it sort of prevented the sport from growing several years back. But now, that's not the case. Sure, South Carolina, there is a definite number one in this sport right now, and it is the Gamecocks. But you got to have another team up there. You got to have some kind of team that can actually compete with them. And that is LSU right now in this sport. This sport has not had a nationally relevant rivalry since UConn Notre Dame in the early 2010s, before UConn started to fall off a little bit, and then eventually Muffin McGraw retired from Notre Dame in the late 2010s. This matchup is also guaranteed to happen every single season. LSU and South Carolina reside in the same conference, and so they're going to play at least once a season. If they meet up in the SEC women's basketball tournament, it might be twice a year. Heck, it could even be 3 times a season if they meet up in the NCAA tournament. And listen, it would not shock me in the slightest bit if in the NCAA tournament this year, South Carolina and LSU were to match up with one another. And then the other thing to keep into account here is the coaches that both of these teams have. Both of them are nationally recognizable coaches. You've got Dawn Staley, who has become a stalwart in this sport and is now considered the best coach in this sport in terms of recruiting, in terms of how she leads her program, how she runs her program, and obviously the results that have come with that on the court. And then you've got Kim Mulkey, who has had a ton of success in her own right. To this point, admittedly, more success than Dawn Staley in several aspects. And Kim Mulkey, look, she is a very polarizing figure. I don't think there's any question about that. You either have people that like her style, like her, again, sort of don't give a crap attitude that sometimes she can throw out there at people. And then you got other people that are sort of, they're pushed back by that. They're kind of taken aback, and maybe they feel like that she should be acting a little bit more like a coach. Not saying that she doesn't, obviously, but that's sort of how people feel about Kim Mulkey. And look, Dawn Staley's got some people that don't like her too. There are people on both sides that don't like either coach. And so that makes this all the more intriguing. It means that you're going to have more people watching this game. So when it comes to the coaches, the lack of a nationally relevant rivalry in this sport, and again, now television networks like ESPN, they don't just have to prop up individual players. Now they've got a game, a specific game every year that they can point to. And for a couple years, it was South Carolina UConn, but obviously right now, that's not really considered a rivalry because UConn has not kept the game competitive. Not South Carolina. It used to be the Gamecocks, but now it's UConn. Now everyone looks forward to South Carolina LSU, and the thing is, they know they're going to get it at least once and maybe more than once every single season. So having this branded as a rivalry would be great for women's college basketball as a whole and would help continue grow the sport even more than it has over the past couple of years. Now, the spring practice schedule got released by South Carolina's football program on Monday evening, along with their spring football roster. And when looking at the football roster, there was something that I picked up on that could be giving us a hint as to what kind of defensive scheme Clayton White and his staff are going to run in 2024. I'll explain more on that in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's gonna win it all. And that includes the women's side as well. And right now, South Carolina is currently listed as the favorite to win the Women's Basketball National Championship, with FanDuel odds makers setting their odds at -130. Obviously, again, they might not be unbeatable, but South Carolina, they're at the top of the sport for a reason. And you know also that they are looking for some revenge after what happened in 2023. So if you want to bet on South Carolina for the women's bracket or look at maybe some of the other games and or props, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. Now, South Carolina, as I mentioned earlier, released its spring football roster on Monday evening. And as soon as they did that, I went and looked at the media guide where the roster was located, and I printed out a version of that roster and then compared it to the roster from the 2023 football season. And I did this just to sort of, point out some differences. Some guys that had changed some jersey numbers, obviously the amount of newcomers that South Carolina has on this team, and also look at any weight changes that may have taken place. And the position group that caught my attention the most in that regard was the edge rusher group. Now, I say all that to lead into this. As we all know, South Carolina, the big question defensively this season is what kind of scheme are they going to run? For the first couple of seasons, Clayton White was running that 4-2-5 defense, and that continued throughout the first, 3 quarters of the 2023 football season. But last fall, obviously, was not so great for the defensive side of the ball for South Carolina. And eventually, they wound up switching their base scheme to more of a 3-3-5 defense, and they saw tremendous success in that regard in the month of November against some teams like Kentucky and Clemson. 2 teams that, probably weren't more than a little bit above average, but still, nonetheless, talented, competitive football programs in college football. So, I went and looked at the edge position group, and the weight changes from that group really caught my attention because I look at a guy like Jatius Gear. In 2023, going into that football season, he was listed at 243 pounds. Now, Jatius Gear is listed at 262 pounds. That's up 19 pounds from where he was last August or September when they last took their weights. Now, Drew Tuazama is another guy that really stuck out to me because he was 275 going into last football season. He is now listed at 290. And then Brian Thomas Jr., he was listed at 232 going into last football season. He's now listed at 245. And for Brian Thomas Jr., that's like saying other guys are now 265, 270 pounds. As we all know, Brian Thomas Jr., he's been on the lighter side for the most part during his college career. So him going up to 245, in my opinion, that's a pretty big deal. So what exactly does this say? Well, in my opinion, it says this. South Carolina, I don't think they're going to get rid of the 4-2-5 or the 3-3-5. I think both are here to stay. But it does seem like that based on the weight of all of the quote-unquote defensive ends, edge rushers, whatever you want to call them at this point, that they're going to lean more towards the 3-3-5 defensive front. And then they will still keep the 4-2-5 package as maybe more of a third down, passing down package. I could definitely see them doing that. That gives a guy like Brian Thomas Jr. a chance to go out there and still play. Because Brian Thomas Jr., let's be honest, I don't think he's going to line up consistently inside of a offensive tackle and do good in that situation. I just don't think that would happen. Dylan Stewart, that's not the best way to utilize a guy of his skill set. And you're certainly not going to sit there and go, well, let's just put him at one of the outside linebacker spots in a 3-3-5 and have him line up like 5-6 yards off the line of scrimmage. If that happens, we need to ask some serious questions about the thought process of the coaching staff. But I don't think it's going to, obviously. I think that, again, that says that both systems are going to stick around, but the 3-3-5, I think, it definitely seems like, just based on looking at the weight numbers here, that that's going to be the base scheme for South Carolina's defensive staff going into the 2024 season. Of course, practice will be starting next week, I believe next Tuesday to be exact, and so it'll be interesting to see if they give us any glimpse of what kind of scheme they're going to run on day one of spring ball. With that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are y'all's thoughts on South Carolina versus LSU in women's college basketball? Do you now consider it a rivalry? And if so, how much good do you think it could do for the sport as a whole? And what are your thoughts on these weight changes with some of these edge rushers on South Carolina's football team? Do you think it's indicative of what they plan to do with their defensive scheme in 2024? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watched today's show on YouTube, or you can shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. But as always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.